Hello, Denton here, with yet another tale from the Viking Age. And this time about a little-known figure to the general public, but one who has caused considerable debate among historians. Some seeing her as a genuine person, others as nothing more than the product of romanticized fiction, and others still seeing her as a combination of both. A real person embellished with the addition of deeds and adventures they never, in fact, did. Her name was Alfhildr, which means elf battle, composed of the elements alf, or elf, and hild, or hildir, battle. And she was supposedly a Scoutmere, or Shieldmaiden, who then became a Viking raider. But before we look at Alfhildr herself and the likelihood of her being a genuine historical figure, we really need to take a moment to consider the Shieldmaidens as a group, themselves often a topic of hot debate, because their very existence is frequently challenged. Something, well, very relevant to any discussion about someone like Alfhildr and the possibility of female Vikings, which would be something that is also, I suppose, frequently questioned. As in the case of Alfhildr, some say Shieldmaidens did exist. Others claim, well, they are nothing more than the product of male fantasy. But strictly speaking, the truth really doesn't belong in either camp. You see, to the question, did Shieldmaidens exist? The answer is no, categorically. No, they did not exist. And, well, yes, actually they did. Now, that's rather a puzzling answer, right? Now, how can something exist at the same time as not existing? But you see, if you see Shieldmaidens as they are depicted in the popular television show Vikings, whole regiments of women carrying matching shields, rank after rank of them marching off to war, with banners waving and drums banging, horns and trumpets blaring, then no, they did not exist. That image is pretty much television show romantic fantasy. Not totally, perhaps, which I'll come to in a moment, but almost so. But if you see them as women who took up arms on occasion, sometimes as individuals or sometimes in small groups, often in response to a sudden need, a village attacked when the men were away, for example, or when the men were hard-pressed against a superior opponent and women would grab weapons and join in the fight, then yes, in that context, they did exist. And, in fact, the term Scoutmere is only mentioned, I think it's once, in the Sagas. It wasn't a term that was actually used to any extent by the Old Norse themselves, though given its usage nowadays, one might think it was on every page. Well, there are many accounts of women taking up arms and joining in battle, or indeed even leading armies. Ragnar Lothbrok's second wife, Osric, for example, attired in chainmail and leading an army against Sweden. Gudrun in the Volsunga Saga, picking up weapons and joining her brothers Gunnar and Hogni in battle, or Freydis Eriksdottir, grabbing up a sword and charging Native Americans, driving them off after the men had, well, not exactly distinguished themselves in the conflict. Stories like that are common enough. Women who took up arms for a reason at a particular moment, but not proper military-trained units, all carrying the same insignia as we see in Vikings. Now, it isn't strictly correct to say there were never any properly trained and organized military groups of women. In fact, there was a group in Denmark of women specially trained as warriors, mentioned by Saxo Grammaticus or Saxo the Learned in his Gesta Danorum, the history of the Danes, circa 1200 AD, in which he writes the following. There were once women in Denmark who dressed themselves to look like men, and spent almost every minute cultivating soldier skills. They courted military expertise so earnestly that anyone might have guessed that they had unsexed themselves. Those especially who had forceful personalities, who were tall and elegant, decided to embark on this way of life. They put toughness before allure, aimed at conflicts instead of kisses, and desired not the couch but the kill, and those they could have appeased with looks, they attacked with lances. Now, this group of women were indeed very like the idea of the Shieldmaidens that we see in Vikings. Women trained to fight as actual warriors, rather than simply grabbing a weapon in time of need, and seemingly very proficient in the use of weapons. But some scholars questioned Saxo's account of these warrior women, and of Alfhildr herself, since it is from Saxo that we get information about her. And certainly he was very unimpressed with the whole idea of warrior women, complaining later in his Gesta Danorum about women who put their hands to the lance, which they should rather have applied to the loom, which I think does rather sum up his opinion. But, to my mind, the fact that he didn't approve of it, that he felt it was wrong and unwomanly, yet spoke of it at great length and stressed the fighting ability of these women, actually gives credence to it. Why would he invent something that he disapproved of, then write about it in a way that made the women look good, admit they possessed military skill, if they had never actually existed? And, even if they had, he didn't like them. Now, if he made it up, would he not have had the women utterly defeated by superior men on every occasion to show how useless they were and not fit to engage in masculine occupations? Also, other characters he mentions are actual proven historic figures. So why would we just assume that Shieldmaidens and Alfhildr are the odd ones out? There are elements in his story of Alfhildr which are clearly embroidered, as indeed all old tales were to greater or lesser extent in those times. They always like to, embellish them a little bit. But the bottom line seems to me to be that as far as Shieldmaidens in general go, one doesn't make up something to show a thing in a favourable light that one doesn't believe in or approved of. In Greek mythology, for example, while the Amazons are shown as powerful warriors with great military skill, they are always defeated by men in the end. Images of them on vases or in murals, for example, always show them being killed by men in various ways. Good though they were, the really woeful masculine attitudes of the ancient Greeks meant that the Amazons had to lose. Men would always triumph. We know that there were female warriors in the army of the Rus, those Swedish Vikings who settled in what is now the Ukraine and Belarus, and over 30 graves have been found across Scandinavia of women buried with weapons. Now, some of those weapons are unsuited to hunting, a sword and a shield, for example, purely military weapons. And should you ever think of going out hunting wild boar with just a sword and a shield, don't, unless, of course, you fancy being the boar's dinner. But the whole question of could or did women fight in Norse times and Shieldmaidens in general is something I'll come back to in a moment. First, to Alfhildr herself. Now, Alfhildr was the daughter of the Geatish king Siward, ruler of Jutland, a region lying in the south of Sweden, and she was regarded as being very beautiful. Saxo stating that she continually kept her face muffled in her robe, lest she should cause her beauty to provoke the passion of others. Oh dear, you couldn't have that. But sadly, royal daughters in those times were regarded more as political pawns than actual people. They were very useful to assist in good relations with surrounding kingdoms, since they could be married off to male members of other royal families to secure trade or military alliances, to cement peaceful relations far better than just a mere treaty would achieve. But they had to be virgins. If they weren't totally pure and unspoiled, they were mere damaged goods and about as useful as a boat with a hole in it. You couldn't have married them off to anyone if you'd given them away for nothing. So King Siward, aware of the political importance of keeping his beautiful daughter in a pure, virginal state, and the need for any potential suitor to be vetted to ensure that he was actually of political use. You couldn't have some minor, unimportant nobleman come along and actually fall in love with her, marry her without gaining any benefit from it, other than her own happiness, of course, which really didn't matter, but no political benefits? That would never do. So he decided the answer was to, basically put her under house arrest, for her own protection, of course, since her great beauty might, provoke the passion of another, as we have already heard. And we are told that he banished her into very close keeping, and gave her a viper and a snake to rear, wishing to defend her chastity with the protection of these reptiles, and that if any man tried to enter and failed, he must straightway yield his head to be taken off and impaled on a spike. Well, that's certainly telling them. You know, I don't quite understand the viper and the snake bit, since a viper is a snake, but well, that's really irrelevant to the story. Now this does rather smack of the embellishment of the tales, I must say. Slithery reptilian guards on duty, tad unusual to say the least, and rather likely to be just fantasy. However, her being locked away and guarded is totally feasible, though not perhaps with snakes. So, there she is, in her chamber, 2 reptiles on guard, placed there by the king with her best interests at heart, of course, loving father that he was, and a decree in place that any unauthorized men trying to gain access would be promptly beheaded. But the snake twins, well, they're not there simply to keep the princess a virgin. Oh, no. They have additional duties, because they would also be the deciding factor as to a suitable suitor, since anyone wishing to obtain the princess would first have to be approved of and then demonstrate his prowess by defeating them. Now, you might think that would reduce the number of suitors quite a bit. I mean, clearly the snake and the viper, or just 2 snakes, well, you know, they were rather more than your average common or garden variety of reptile. But it didn't. And before long, there were quite a few heads rotting on spikes outside the palace. None of them had made it past the snake and the other snake, who were doing their job pretty well, it seems. 100% success. No complaints there. But now, along comes Prince Alf. No, nothing to do with that funny, fuzzy alien from the American TV show of the same name. He is the son of King Saga of Denmark, himself of Geatish descent, and we are told, then Alf, thinking that the peril of the attempt only made it nobler, declared himself a wooer, and was told to subdue the beasts that kept watch beside the room of the maiden, insomuch as, according to the decree, the embraces of the maiden were the prize of the subduer. Apparently, neither the by now formidable kill count of unsuccessful suitors by the snake duo and the possible headless fate he awaited should he fail seemed to bother him, for he excelled the rest in spirit. And he was apparently well used to fighting, as we are told that he devoted himself to the business of a rover. Now that suggests that he went Vikinger. In other words, he was a Viking in the true sense of the word, going to sea in a ship. So, well, I suppose a couple of snakes didn't strike him as much by way of opposition, since I'm sure his own opinion of himself was complimentary in the extreme. Now, how big these snakes were, I suppose, is a question. And from the description of the subsequent battle, it would seem they were not the kind you could just put your foot on and hold them down. They were of a prodigious size. I mean, I think we're talking like 30-foot anacondas here. But they didn't seem to faze Prince Alf, who was obviously very brave. Or just an idiot, which is often pretty much the same thing. People have often been credited with great bravery when actually they were just fools. And you know, I've actually heard military people say that being brave is knowing the risk and still doing what had to be done, while anyone totally without fear, well, they're also totally without a brain. I'll let you decide which category to put Prince Alf into. Of course, her total joy at having him as her husband was simply taken for granted. There was no need to consult Alfhildr on the matter. I mean, why would you bother doing that? I mean, after all, what woman in her right mind could fail to fall madly in love with a walking wonder of masculinity like Prince Alf? But I must say he had put a lot of thought into this snake fighting thing. He was clearly a bit more intellectual than those who had gone before and whose heads were now decorating the outside of the palace. And he arrived with a lump of red-hot metal held in a pair of tongs and a spear, and his body covered with blood-soaked hides. Now that was in order to make the snakes mad with the scent of blood and hopefully get them to do something stupid. When they, as hoped, driven to distraction by all that blood, rushed to attack him, he rammed the hot metal into the yawning throat of the viper, and the spear he shoved into the gaping mouth of the snake as it wound and writhed forward. Yeah. And with the guards now disposed of, he marched triumphantly into the bedchamber, assuming that Alfhildr would be totally smitten by his amazing bravery and wonderful combat skills, to say nothing, of course, of his outstanding charm and good looks and so forth. I mean, that's what maidens were supposed to do, take one look at the dashing hero and swoon at his feet, just overwhelmed with the passion of it. That's the way it was in all the best sagas. Yeah, but unfortunately, see, things started to go just a bit wrong in this case. Alfhildr wasn't very impressed with her possible husband-to-be, possibly due to his arriving wrapped in smelly, blood-soaked hides and probably liberally splattered with snake blood. But her father, good King Sigurd, was happy enough with the prince, probably after he'd had a bath. But then the king seems to have remembered that one is supposed to love one's children and actually care about their happiness and, stuff like that. And maybe handing her to the first guy able to kill a couple of snakes really wasn't very loving. So now he decides to move the goalposts, and he starts acting like a loving father that time, stating that he would accept that man only for his daughter's husband, of whom she made a free and decided choice. So, loving daddy makes just reptile slaughter no longer enough to claim his daughter. She actually has to have a say in who she will marry, be sexually intimate with, have children for, and so on. You see, daddy really cared about her happiness after all. And just when you were thinking he was a big shit. Now, that was perfectly in line with Norse tradition. A woman had the right to refuse marriage to a man if she so chose. A woman had the right to say no. Hers was the final word on the subject, and no shame or loss of face was attached to it. But, throughout the sagas, just as in fairy stories right across medieval Europe, it always seemed to be that a fair maiden, especially one who had been rescued by a heroic warrior, always fell madly in love with him at first sight, even when they knew absolutely nothing about him. They never rejected him. I mean, he could be the village idiot. He could be a mass murderer. He could be anything. But they didn't care. They took one look, instant love, and they lived happily ever after. Like that was going to happen. Very, very Disney, if you like. So King Sigurd and probably everybody else, especially Prince Alf, of course, just assumed that Alfhildr would throw herself into his arms, accept his proposal with gushing outpourings of sentimental romantic joy as little tweeting birds flew around her head, and then they would go through the usual Old Norse rituals, such as the groom-to-be breaking into a family tomb to obtain a sword used by his ancestors and presenting it as a wedding gift, and so on. But Alfhildr, already unimpressed with her knight in blood-soaked hides arrival, and apparently not liking him any more afterwards than she had before, combined with her not desiring to leave Sweden and go and live in Denmark, chose the no option. Of course, her loving father, despite suddenly thinking so much of her happiness, wasn't going to take no for an answer, regardless of his daughter's right to it, his desire for a nice political pact with Denmark outweighing any considerations of his daughter's happiness or right of refusal, of which Alfhildr would have been perfectly aware. Marrying her off and her hopefully one day becoming Queen of Denmark was far too tempting for her to have any say in the matter. Seemingly her mother wasn't exactly impressed with the idea either, and at her suggestion, Alfhildr dressed herself in men's clothes. She slipped out of the palace, joined up with a group of other women who had no desire to marry, who for some reason just happened to be there for her to join up with, and they all headed for the coast, there to do what any woman not wanting to marry would do: find a ship, learn how it worked, and sail off for adventure as pirates. I mean, wouldn't you? It's so obvious. Olaus Magnus, a Swedish writer and Catholic ecclesiastic who lived from 1490 to 1557, describes it thus in his book, A Description of the Northern Peoples, published in 1555. For she so much preferred a life of valour to one of ease that, when she might have enjoyed the pleasure of royalty, drawn by a woman's madness, she suddenly plunged into the hazards of war. Her determination to stay chaste was so steadfast that she began to reject all men, and firmly resolved with herself never to have intercourse with any, but from then on to equal or even to surpass male courage in the practice of piracy. Now, Saxo's account never mentioned any real details of her transformation from pampered princess to fierce Viking raider, nor how she and the group of like-minded marriage-avoiding women she just happened to team up with so conveniently obtained the required skills of nautical navigation and the use of weapons. That seems like something that would have taken a considerable time. And that fact has been brought up to discredit the story. How, some have asked, could these women have mastered the use of weapons so quickly, or learned things required to sail a ship? Could they have even managed to get a ship out of the harbour, let alone navigate it across the sea? That is, of course, a fair comment. Sword fighting can't be learned in an afternoon, and nautical navigation is quite complex. But we do see that many Norse women are mentioned in the sagas as taking up arms and fighting against men, and doing so without any difficulty, seemingly the equal of the men, or at least not getting themselves killed, something they couldn't do, I should say, without some degree of training. Anyone can point a gun and pull the trigger. A 5-year-old can do that, but combat with a sword requires a degree of skill, which suggests that at least some Norse women did have weapons training. As I said, when they take up arms in the sagas, they're not killed. In fact, they usually end up on the winning side. Impossible without some degree of skill. So it seems to me quite likely that some, at least, of the women who joined Alfhildr were acquainted with weapons, or indeed that Alfhildr herself had practiced with weapons in the palace. And women would have accompanied men on trading expeditions from time to time, especially local ones to nearby markets, so that one or two of the women might have had a knowledge of ships. That's not beyond the realm of possibility. They also persuaded the crews of other ships to join them. For example, to begin with, they, quote, happened to come to a spot where a band of rovers were lamenting the death of their captain, who had been lost in war. And Alfhildr managed to get them to join her, accepting her as their new captain. So a lot of skills could have been acquired in that manner from men who could join them and could then pass on their skills, taking on those who were skilled in fighting or sailing and training on the job, you could say. Anyway, she eventually managed to acquire a fleet, and she began raiding along the Baltic coast with a woman named Groa as her second in command. Now, we really don't have any details of her raids as such, but they must have been at least somewhat successful, certainly against Denmark, since King Sigurd sent out several fleets to try and put a stop to her activities, one of them with the rejected Prince Alf in command. I suppose he had good reason to want to find her and have a pleasant little chat with her about her very humiliating rejection of him. And he pursued her all around the Baltic Sea. Though she tried to outrun him, his ships were equal to hers in speed, so she was unable ever to get enough distance between the two fleets to evade him, to maybe slip into a hidden cove or something. And eventually he trapped her in the Gulf of Finland. She had more ships than he did. He was outnumbered. But, this was a man unafraid of a couple of snakes, so a bigger fleet of ships was nothing to him. What could be seen as, very brave, or just plain stupid, and indeed a tad uncaring about the lives of his followers. But either way, he ignored his lack of men, and he attacked in the usual Norse method of naval warfare, which wasn't really naval warfare because, you used to board the other ship and basically fight a land battle at sea. He fought his way from ship to ship, many of his men falling, as did many of Alfhildr's women and those who had joined her. And after some pretty brutal ship-hopping, he finally reached her own ship, and he boarded it. We are told that he advanced towards the stern, slaughtering all that withstood him. He was great Prince Alf, after all. Now, his second in command was a man named Bolgar, and he was fighting one of the pirates when he struck the pirate's helmet and it fell to the deck. Bolgar doesn't seem to have pressed his advantage. Presumably he realized that the now helmetless pirate didn't really look too much like what he thought a pirate ought to look like. And Alf Now, Alf realized there was something less than masculine about this pirate at a glance. Could it be? Yes, it was! It was Alfhildr herself! Oh, he was very sharp, our Alf. No flies on him. Spotted her at once. And he and Bolgar ordered everyone to stop fighting, or at least everyone who was still alive, which in view of they having slaughtered their way across all those ships but one, it was probably not all that many. Saxo tells us, seeing the smoothness of her chin, he saw that he must fight with kisses and not with arms, that the cruel spears must be put away, and the enemy handled with gentler dealings. He took hold of her eagerly, and made her change her man's apparel to a woman's, and afterwards begot on her a daughter, Gurrid. Borgar also married, taking Alfhildr's second-in-command, Groa, to wife. After this, Alfhildr disappeared from the historical record. The prince certainly didn't waste any time, and either Alfhildr was so impressed with his fighting skills that she changed her mind about him. After all, he had fought his way across several ships to get to her, or she still hated the sight of him, but he just didn't care. Why she would run away from the prince and become a Viking in order to get away from him and then marry him and have his baby, well, that's not explained. That does seem a trifle odd. Of course, by doing that, she was returning to what Saxo would have seen as her proper womanly duties. Marry, make babies. That's what women were supposed to do. So that could have a bearing on it, showing her repenting her unwomanly ways, seeing the error of a woman trying to emulate men and doing the right thing by returning to the marrying and baby-making stuff. Bolgar also did pretty well for himself, it seems. And how ironic that the prince's second-in-command should marry Alfhildr's second-in-command. Oh, how romantic. Of course, in Groa's case, she too was turning her back on unwomanly masculine things and being a proper woman who now knew her place. Marry a man, do her proper duty. Marry, make babies. That's what women do. Yes, I suppose no more need be said on that subject. So, did Alfhildr actually exist, or was she simply a fictional character? Well, others mentioned in the sagas were genuine historical characters, and Saxo confirms that there were indeed warrior women in Denmark, Shieldmaidens if you like, and that they were apparently very skilled, something he would hardly have done were it not true, since he clearly disapproved of it. So his probably grudging admission of their abilities seems confirmation of their actual existence. Now, his account of Alfhildr isn't quite the same. It's very much slanted to show how she abandoned the proper role of a Norse woman, rather than any great combat skills on her part. That she, devoted those hands to the lance which they should rather have applied to the loom. He's not being as complimentary to her as he was to the Danish women. And further, he suggests that those men who joined her, accepting her as their leader, didn't do so because they admired her great military skills and superb leadership or navigational skills. No, they admired her great physical beauty. So he's trying to underplay her actual abilities as a Viking raider, suggesting that the acceptance of her as leader was nothing to do with her abilities. They simply saw her as a pin-up girl. Of course, to counter that argument, and I think it's a very good counter, one must ask, would those men have put their safety, their very lives, in the hands of an incompetent, unskilled leader just because she looked good? In that case, they might just as well have nailed the 9th century equivalent of a Playboy centerfold to the mast and made it the leader. Frankly, I can't see any Vikings actually doing that, allowing themselves to be led by someone with no ability to lead. I mean, that would be a very quick and easy way to end up dead. So the fact that the men in that age would accept a woman in command has to indicate that she impressed them with her ability, as was the case with Ordir Ketilsdottir, known as the Deep Thinker, who commanded her own ship with a male crew under her. They had no problem with that. Saxo's writings are, of course, heavily influenced by Christian teachings, and she had been a pagan, living over 300 years before his time, so his opinions do have to be seen in that context. He probably slanted things quite a bit for a Christian viewpoint, as indeed Snorri Sturluson had done in Iceland when he wrote his Eddas. Believe it or not, the story of Alfhildr and Prince Alf was actually made into 2 Italian operas. Yes, I kid you not, using a variation of her name, Alfhildr. One was in 1686, La Amazzone Corsara, ovvero La Alvida Regina di Goti, or something sort of like that, by Carlo Pallavicino, whom I must admit I've never heard of, and the other was in 1731, Alvida Regina di Goti, by Antonio Vivaldi, who was, of course, a very, very famous composer indeed. That's quite an interesting little tidbit, I'm sure, and in the famous words of Michael Caine, not a lot of people know that. But what of the question of the Shieldmaidens themselves as such, which I've already alluded to? The warrior women of Denmark, mentioned by Saxo, do seem factual, and there is also an account of an 8th century battle, the Battle of Bråvalla, between Sweden and Denmark, in which 300 female warriors were said to have taken part, even naming some of them, Hedborg, Visna and Hed among them. Visna was said to have had her arm cut off while carrying the Danish banner, and a warrior named Viborg was credited with killing a champion male warrior. Now, historians are divided as to whether the battle was real or was simply symbolic, because other historical records of it can't be verified, nor the exact site where it actually occurred. But I think it has to be considered that if it is entirely fictitious, it shows that the concept of women in battle was accepted. And this is clearly demonstrated in the sagas by the number of references to women engaging in combat for various reasons. And other characters never seem to find it odd or to complain about it. You don't have Hogni and Gunnar telling Gudrun she's embarrassing them, or Osrug's sons saying, "Mother, go home! What will the men think of being led by a woman?" Nor does the army led into battle by Hervor Heidrichtsdottir seem to have any problem being under her command. A female Viking called the Red Woman is actually mentioned in Irish chronicles. And here in Ireland itself, women were actually trained as warriors in the Celtic times until a law was passed ending the practice, which, for those who doubt, proves the truth of it. They would hardly bother enacting a law to stop something that wasn't actually happening. Sure, that'd be a real Irish joke, wouldn't it? As to could women fight with swords or axes against men, the answer is yes. Speed, skill, experience, training, and aggressive determination, a bloodlust, you might say, that can beat sheer size and strength. While the alpha male may not like that idea, certainly not want to admit it, and delight in showing videos on YouTube of women getting beaten by men, often untrained women, it must be pointed out. But there are many examples of women overcoming much larger men in judo, jiu-jitsu, aikido, wrestling, and, yes, armed combat with swords, real swords. Now, I know 2 normal-sized women who engage in armed combat with swords, spears, and axes, often full-contact armoured fighting, where real weapons, blunt but still real swords made of steel, and axes, just as heavy as those used over 1,000 years ago, are used. And they routinely beat the men, not by strength and size, but by speed and ability. Well, very simply put, they're better. The men, not bigger. And the men hate it. Oh, they really do. One of them I have fought myself, without even scoring a single hit on her, and being killed every time. In fact, she's the fastest fighter in the combat group. Her speed is actually quite amazing. I've never seen anyone move so fast. And nobody, not even professional movie and TV extras who have worked on Vikings or Game of Thrones, can beat her. We were doing shield walls. There were like 20 of us in the group. And she was the only one who was not killed several times over. Had it been real combat with edged weapons, she would have been the only one left alive. I think that in itself answers the question of could Shieldmaidens have fought against men. Now, whether they actually did is beside the point. They could have. It is worth noting that one of the greatest samurai in Japan was, in fact, a woman, Tomoe Gozen, the beautiful samurai, as she was known, becoming the principal warrior of a warlord, And Marco Polo tells us that the niece of the great Khan was so skilled in wrestling that no man could beat her. Also, it must be borne in mind that, as in the videos I've mentioned where men beat women, and this is held up to show, oh, women can't fight, look, the man beat that woman, that, as I said, the women are often untrained and very obviously know nothing about fighting. But even those who do are bound by rules. Rules that often give advantage to size and strength because they limit the participants, ruling out anything potentially dangerous. The very things that would be helpful for a woman in a real fight, things that could incapacitate an opponent. After all, that's what you want to do in a real fight. You know, in real combat, there are no rules where you can punch to the throat, you can kick the testicles, gouge the eyes, where maiming or killing the opponent is perfectly okay. Well, you know, things can be a little different in that. A quick, skillful woman could bring down a man with a blow in the right place, a blow forbidden in sporting events. And with a sword in her hand, well, you know, there's certainly no way for a certain victory for the man, especially in situations where, well, say a woman's children are in danger, her family is threatened, and that were added to any skill she possessed. You know, getting in the way of a female, either human or animal, is what I'm trying to say. Yes, I really should stop drinking at New Year, shouldn't I? You know, getting in the way of a female protecting her young, well, that is not something you really want to do. And in Viking-era sword fighting, you don't just stand and let the opponent hit your shield, you know, absorbing the kinetic energy of each blow. No, I mean, a woman would do very badly if she did that, as would a small man against a much larger one, it must be pointed out. But, I mean, you use a shield to deflect the blow, to turn it away so you can strike. So the idea that a man could simply batter a woman into the ground, as I've often seen stated, is totally wrong, if she was trained to fight and had skill in doing it. So there we leave Alfhildr and her Viking fleet, and the question of Shieldmaidens. Did the Shieldmaidens exist? Yes, in the sense of women who fought. Saxo's grudging admission of that is proof enough. Could women fight successfully against men with swords or axes? Yes, the two I know prove that, since they do it on a regular basis. Did Alfhildr actually exist? Now, that's the hardest question to answer. It's quite possible that the tale is fact, with a few embellishments, as was the norm back then, when nobody recounted anything without some added bits that spiced it up a little. Much like a Hollywood so-called true story, where there is often very little truth about it. Or it could be total fiction, or fiction that was inspired by true events, or like Ragnar Lothbrok, she might be a combination of several actual women while not existing as herself. We simply don't know, but it is possible. So, I hope you enjoyed that video, including, as it did, a few little vocal fluffs. And for now, I shall say farewell. There you are, I did it again. Let me just try this again once more from the top, as we used to say in the theatre. Farewell. There you go, got it right that time. Until the next time, goodbye for now.